They warned him, they isolated him, they sanctioned him. But Ibrahim Traoré didn't stop. He did the one thing that terrifies global powers. He acted without permission. Now the West is no longer in control, and the world is watching in disbelief. What has he done? And why is Burkina Faso now the symbol of something far greater than rebellion? Let's uncover what they never wanted us to see. For decades, the global order assumed Africa would always obey, that nations like Burkina Faso would remain dependent, fractured, and waiting for instructions. But then came a man who neither asked nor accepted permission, Ibrahim Traoré. His rise was not born in political parties or elite corridors. It came from the trenches, from the dust, from the frustration of a generation watching their country rot while foreign missions lectured and looted. At just 34 years old, he did the unthinkable. He seized power in a country that had been paralyzed by coups, terrorism, and economic suffocation. And unlike many before him, he didn't make promises to donors or declarations to old allies. He spoke to his people, not with prepared speeches, but with clarity and fire. He didn't wear the polished suit of a career diplomat. He wore the uniform of a soldier who had seen what abandonment looks like. And that image, that voice, shattered expectations across Africa. The West watched, at first with caution, then with alarm. Because Traoré wasn't playing by the old rules. He rejected IMF loans, he expelled foreign troops, he called out institutions by name, but what truly frightened them was what he did next. He began building, not in theory, in practice. Clinics reopened, roads were paved, schools were restored, mining revenues once siphoned abroad were redirected into domestic programs. In less than a year, a forgotten, landlocked country began to move with purpose, and the people noticed. In the villages where water taps hadn't run for years, they flowed again. In neighborhoods where electricity was a rumor, lights came on. No fanfare, no PR campaigns, just results. But the results were dangerous, because they undermined the story the world had long told about Africa, that without foreign guidance, nothing would function. Traoré was proving otherwise, and that more than any speech or rally became the true threat. Still, the pressure came, sanctions, suspensions, accusations, yet Traoré didn't back down. He responded by pulling his country even further from the orbit of dependency. He aligned with other Sahel nations, Mali and Niger, forming an alliance based not just on defense, but on defiance. Together, they declared they would no longer be ruled by distant conferences or external mandates. They would chart their own course, even if it meant isolation. To many in global power circles, this sounded like suicide, but to millions of Africans, it sounded like liberation. For the first time in living memory, a leader in uniform was not speaking of staying in power. He was speaking of restoring power to the people. And that message caught fire. From university halls to village markets, Traoré became more than a president. He became a symbol, not of perfection, but of possibility. His words echoed Thomas Sankara, but his actions reflected a new generation, one tired of inherited scripts. He didn't sell dreams. He demanded responsibility. And in doing so, he rewrote what leadership in Africa could look like. But as hope surged within, fear surged outside. Western diplomats warned of instability. Think tanks raised alarms about anti-democratic sentiment. Media outlets labeled him unpredictable. Yet the real question they couldn't answer was simple. Why was Burkina Faso suddenly working better without them? Traoré didn't just govern, he provoked a continent-wide reckoning. And as he moved forward, so did the nation behind him. Not perfectly, not without risk, but finally with purpose. When Ibrahim Traoré took power, the assumption among international observers was that he would either become a typical military strongman or crumble under pressure. But what followed defied every prediction. Instead of consolidating power through fear, he began dismantling the structures of dependency that had paralyzed Burkina Faso for decades. The first blow came against foreign-controlled mining contracts. In a country where billions in gold, zinc, and manganese had flowed out with barely a trace left behind, Traoré demanded renegotiation. Some companies withdrew, others protested, but new legislation was passed ensuring a majority stake of extractive profits would stay in the country. Revenues that once disappeared into offshore accounts began funding public services. This was not symbolic. It was systemic. And it was only the beginning. He banned GMO imports tied to foreign agribusiness and launched a national food sovereignty plan based on traditional farming techniques. Agricultural collectives were revived. Government grants supported small farmers instead of export-driven monocrops. Food prices stabilized. For a population that had suffered hunger not from lack of land, but from broken systems, this shift was revolutionary. But while the ground shifted at home, pressure intensified abroad. Foreign media labeled him a populist. Financial institutions issued dire warnings about investor confidence. Diplomats whispered about instability. Yet within Burkina Faso, something rare was taking shape. People were starting to believe in governance again. Not because everything was perfect, but because for the first time, it felt like the government was theirs. Civil servants who had once clocked in without conviction were now attending anti-corruption workshops. Neighborhood committees began monitoring infrastructure projects. Soldiers received new training focused on civilian protection, not regime security. A culture of service was returning, and with it, dignity. Still, the backlash came. NGOs accused his administration of shrinking democratic space. Some were expelled. Others had their budgets audited. Western embassies reduced their visibility. Yet Traoré didn't respond with paranoia or revenge. He responded with clarity. Democracy without dignity is just decoration, he declared in a nationally televised speech. We are not closing space, we are opening our future. That future included deeper cooperation with fellow Sahel nations. The alliance with Mali and Niger wasn't just a strategic defense pact, it was a reimagining of what regional unity could look like outside ECOWAS, outside colonial frameworks, outside the monetary leash of the CFA franc. Together they began talks on a common currency, a shared customs system, and coordinated border defense. It wasn't fast, it wasn't easy, but it was intentional. Meanwhile, the West scrambled to respond. Sanctions failed to collapse the economy. Public support remained high. Attempts to paint Traoré as a rogue fell flat when juxtaposed with rising literacy rates and healthcare access. And behind closed doors, even skeptical diplomats began asking themselves uncomfortable questions. What if he's actually succeeding? What if this isn't temporary? What if this is the model others will follow? In response, some foreign powers increased outreach to neighboring states, trying to isolate the Sahel alliance. Others doubled down on aid to competing governments, hoping to draw contrast. But the truth was harder to contain. On the ground, in real life, people were experiencing the difference. The roads were being repaired, clinics were being stocked, schools were reopening. For many Burkinabe, that was all the proof they needed. They didn't need endorsements from international agencies. They needed water, work, and a future. And that's what they were beginning to receive. From a leader who did not ask what the world expected, but what his people deserved. Inside Burkina Faso, the effects of Traoré's governance were not only visible in policies but in posture. A nation once hunched over by decades of corruption and fatigue was beginning to stand taller. Government buildings that had long symbolized inaccessibility were now filled with young civil servants trained under a new code: efficiency, humility, transparency. Ministries were forced to publish public spending reports. Senior officials who failed to meet their targets were dismissed. The culture of impunity that had long strangled development began to erode. Traoré didn't shout about reform. He executed it with military precision. His focus was clear: reduce dependency, increase performance. Entire departments were reshuffled, not based on political loyalty, but on merit and community engagement. Women were appointed to key portfolios in health, education, and trade, not as tokens, but as proven problem solvers. These weren't cosmetic changes. They were structural resets. Local councils were restructured to give more decision-making power to elders and youth representatives. District budgets were decentralized. Projects that once required approval from foreign-funded task forces were now decided in town halls. Traoré's administration encouraged every citizen to become a stakeholder. This wasn't theory, it was implementation. Yet perhaps the most radical transformation was in the military itself. For decades, the Burkina Faso army had been poorly paid, poorly trained, and plagued by factionalism. Under Traoré, that changed, not by expanding its size, but by redefining its purpose. Soldiers were deployed not only to fight terrorism, but to rebuild bridges, protect schools, escort medical convoys, and train in human rights law. Morale skyrocketed, casualties dropped, recruitment surged. But this military revival wasn't about glorification. It was about reassigning the sword to the service of the people. At the same time, foreign bases and private security contractors were gradually removed. "We cannot claim to be sovereign while asking others to die for us," Traoré declared. And with those words, he launched a program to train 50,000 national defense volunteers drawn from rural communities. It was risky. Critics warned of militia rule. But what emerged instead was a citizen force that understood its terrain, its people, and its mission. And the results were undeniable. Attacks in northern provinces dropped. Displacement numbers fell. Farmers returned to their fields. Markets reopened. The nation was still at war, but it was no longer at the mercy of outsiders. While these internal changes were gaining traction, the West intensified its narrative campaign. Reports were released accusing the government of press restrictions, political intolerance, and rising authoritarianism. Yet within Burkina Faso, public forums had increased, radio stations were thriving, and even opposition figures who once feared arrest were engaging in national debate. The state wasn't suppressing ideas, it was reshaping the arena in which ideas were heard. The difference was that now foreign influence was no longer centered in those arenas. The NGOs, consultants, and diplomats who once had front-row seats to policymaking were now in the spectator stands. That shift stung because it meant that decisions were being made based on local need, not foreign feedback. It wasn't isolationism, it was recalibration. And for many Burkinabe, that recalibration felt like oxygen. In rural clinics, mothers could now access prenatal care without paying bribes. In urban schools, teachers received salaries on time. In small businesses, local banks offered microloans without donor oversight. These were not headlines in international newspapers, but they were the daily victories that built trust. Trust in a government that didn't promise miracles but delivered basics. In a world where so many leaders governed through spectacle, Traoré governed through results, quietly, relentlessly. And as Burkina Faso rose from its knees, the world began to understand. This wasn't just a phase, it was the start of a new era. The changes in Burkina Faso were not happening in a vacuum. Across the Sahel and beyond, governments, activists, and ordinary citizens were watching with both awe and anxiety. For decades, African nations had been told that reform required compliance, that progress depended on alignment with Western-led institutions, that the price of development was silence, patience, and external validation. But Traoré was tearing that script apart, and the world was beginning to take notice. In neighboring Mali and Niger, military leaders inspired by his approach began echoing his language: sovereignty, dignity, self-reliance. In student forums from Senegal to Sudan, his speeches were analyzed not just as political rhetoric, but as ideological manifestos. He was becoming more than a national leader. He was becoming the symbol of a possible African future, one unshackled from the bureaucracy of donors and the choreography of imported democracy. And that possibility terrified the old order. Western governments, already reeling from the ejection of their troops from the Sahel, saw their strategic foothold weakening. Their economic influence, too, began to erode. Mining contracts were renegotiated, embassy privileges re-examined, foreign aid scrutinized. Traoré didn't reject all cooperation, but he redefined its terms. He demanded respect instead of conditions, partnership instead of paternalism, and he was willing to walk away if those terms were denied. That, more than anything, broke the model, because it revealed that Africa's dependence was never absolute. It was engineered. And if Burkina Faso, one of the world's poorest and most destabilized nations, could start to break that cycle, then what excuse did the rest of the continent have? This question became the unspoken crisis among international institutions. It wasn't just that Traoré was challenging Western power, it was that he was doing it effectively. Under his rule, inflation had stabilized. Infrastructure spending increased. Child mortality rates began to drop. None of this fit the narrative of collapse. And so, a new narrative was pushed, that he was authoritarian, dangerous, unpredictable. Media stories painted him as a messianic populist, stoking nationalist fervor to entrench himself. But inside Burkina Faso, the reality felt different. People were not worshiping Traoré. They were supporting results. They were responding to a rare experience in African politics: consistency. He said he would reject foreign control, and he did. He said he would fund development internally, and he did. He said the military would serve the people, and it did. It wasn't propaganda, it was performance. That distinction became clearer every year. And for a population long accustomed to betrayal, that clarity felt revolutionary. Meanwhile, across ECOWAS, nervous glances were exchanged in government halls. Member states began to split, some doubling down on old alliances, others quietly signaling interest in the Sahel model. Whispers of a pan-Sahel currency emerged. Joint border patrols expanded. Agricultural trade bypassed regional bottlenecks. A shadow ecosystem was forming, one outside the conventional frameworks, one bound not by treaties but by shared disobedience. And that ecosystem was not just functional, it was attractive for young Africans in search of dignity, for elders tired of circular promises, for nations seeking to stand on their own feet. What Traoré had ignited was no longer a single nation's gamble. It had become a continental challenge to the illusion of African helplessness. He didn't promise perfection, but he dared to promise self-direction. And in doing so, he exposed the fear behind so much of the West's interventionism, that if Africa ever chose its own path, it might never return to the one designed for it. That truth, raw and undeniable, now hovered above every new construction project, every military drill, every press conference in Ouagadougou. Burkina Faso was no longer a failed state. It was a mirror, and what it reflected made powerful people deeply uncomfortable. The more effective Traoré became, the more desperate his critics grew. Sanctions were tightened, diplomatic ties were reduced. Western-funded civil society groups issued joint letters accusing him of shrinking democratic space and centralizing power. Foreign analysts flooded global media with grim forecasts, predicting economic collapse, civil unrest, or military breakdown. But none of it materialized, because the truth on the ground was harder to manipulate. In marketplaces, the shelves were stocked. In villages, clean water flowed. In schools, children sat with books again. The doomsday predictions weren't just wrong, they felt dishonest. And that dishonesty began to erode the credibility of Traoré's critics faster than he ever could have hoped. At the center of this storm stood ECOWAS, once viewed as the anchor of West African stability. Now it found itself exposed, paralyzed, divided, and lacking moral leverage. When ECOWAS threatened sanctions and intervention, the people of Burkina Faso didn't protest their government. They protested ECOWAS. They blocked its convoys. They burned its flags, not because they hated regional cooperation, but because they saw through its contradiction. This was the same bloc that had tolerated third-term presidents, disputed elections, and elite corruption for years without consequence. But now it claimed to be defending democracy by attacking the first government in decades that delivered results. The hypocrisy was unbearable. And in that contradiction, ECOWAS lost its people. It tried to isolate Traoré diplomatically, but ended up isolating itself morally. Meanwhile, new alliances emerged. The Sahel trio, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, launched the AES not just as a security pact, but as a platform for rethinking what sovereignty could mean. They coordinated defense procurement, intelligence sharing, and even economic policy. When one was threatened, all three responded. When one was sanctioned, all three adapted. It was unity not forged in diplomacy, but in defiance. That unity spilled over into the streets. Across the Sahel, murals of Traoré stood next to Sankara, Lumumba, and Nkrumah. His face appeared on T-shirts, his speeches translated into local dialects, not because he demanded it, but because the people needed a symbol that their struggle wasn't madness, that it was history returning. And still the world kept asking, How could someone so young, so inexperienced, command such loyalty? The answer was simple. He listened. He walked markets without bodyguards. He met with village elders without scripts. He asked what was broken, and he fixed what he could. In an age of arrogance, he chose humility. In an age of spectacle, he chose substance. And it worked. But beyond Burkina Faso, ripple effects began shaking old assumptions. Countries that once mocked the Sahel path now began studying it. Debt-ridden governments quietly sent delegations to Ouagadougou. Economists who once laughed at local currency ideas began calculating feasibility. African youth, long disillusioned, began organizing online, in universities, in workplaces, asking why they couldn't demand more from their own leaders. The West responded with what it knew best: more reports, more warnings, more offers of conditional aid. But the spell was breaking. The language of diplomacy had lost its magic, because the people had seen results without it. They had tasted pride without apology. They had glimpsed a future not built for them, but by them, and they wanted more. The fear was no longer that Burkina Faso might collapse. The fear was that it might succeed, that it might prove that governance rooted in sovereignty, dignity, and service could outperform governance rooted in dependency, compromise, and silence. And that proof would spread faster than any policy document, faster than any sanctions list, faster than any narrative. It would spread because it was real, because it was visible, and because once a people see what is possible, they will never again accept what is imposed. As the days turned into months and Burkina Faso's reforms held firm, it became harder and harder for global powers to explain what was happening. The usual narratives no longer applied. There was no donor blueprint being followed, no Western consultants behind the scenes, no dependency on peacekeeping forces or foreign advisors. And yet, schools remained open, public services expanded, and national security improved. The West had long claimed to want stability in Africa, but now that it was emerging without their hand guiding it, the tone shifted from support to suspicion. Reports were commissioned to investigate how Traoré had circumvented traditional governance models. Conferences were held to debate whether sovereign experimentation posed a regional threat. In reality, the threat wasn't military, it was ideological. Because if one of the most fragile states on the continent could achieve meaningful reform without external control, what did that say about the rest of the development industry? What did that say about decades of policy prescriptions, structural adjustment programs, democracy promotion grants, and endless summits? It said they had failed. And more painfully, it said that Africa may have known how to help itself all along, if only it had been left to try. Traoré's speeches began to reflect this deeper philosophy. He no longer simply denounced foreign interference. He began articulating a vision of Africa beyond trauma, beyond apology. In one nationally broadcast address, he declared, "We are not the shadows of former empires. We are the architects of what comes next." That line struck a nerve, not because it was radical, but because it was obvious, and yet had never been allowed to be said aloud. It became a rallying cry across universities, worker unions, and youth organizations. And as more African citizens began rejecting the idea that progress required permission, the international development apparatus found itself gasping for legitimacy. They had statistics, but Traoré had stories. They had policy documents, but he had clinics being built. They had advisors, but he had communities testifying to change. And in that gap between theory and reality, something broke. For the first time in decades, African governments, at least those watching carefully, realized they had leverage. They didn't have to accept every loan, every condition, every invitation. They could say no. They could negotiate from a place of strength, not because they were militarily powerful, but because they had something more potent, an alternative model. Traoré had not merely survived under pressure, he had thrived under siege. And in doing so, he had revealed that sovereignty is not a luxury, it is a strategy. The power of his example didn't come from charisma alone, it came from performance, from the ability to point at a map and say, "There, we fixed that road." To walk into a village and hear, "Yes, our children are in school now." to pass by a market and know this economy is ours again. It wasn't grand speeches or foreign praise that gave Burkina Faso its new identity. It was sweat, discipline, and relentless focus. And all of it was being done with African solutions, African capacity, African vision. That is what made him dangerous. Not that he had defied the West, but that he no longer needed it. And that message was spreading, not through embassies or reports, but through whispers, through stories, through hope. For the first time in a long time, Africa was being inspired by itself. And that inspiration was building a momentum that no amount of sanctions could stop. It was no longer just a movement. It was a mood, a wave of realization washing across a continent long told that its salvation would arrive in envelopes, in embassies, in economic prescriptions drafted elsewhere. But now the winds were shifting. Across the Sahel, in the heart of West Africa, a small, landlocked nation had challenged the very idea that liberation needed approval. And with every policy enacted, with every village revived, Burkina Faso was asking a question that could no longer be ignored. What if we were always capable, but never allowed? The symbolism of that question cut deeper than any headline. In town halls and radio shows, citizens who once had no interest in government began asking about budgets, roads, and supply chains. Civil society wasn't disappearing, it was evolving. No longer beholden to donor logic or scripted advocacy, it was becoming rooted in local realities. Youth organizations formed task forces not to publish reports but to deliver results, repairing classrooms, clearing irrigation canals, replanting forests. Traoré's government didn't direct this energy, it unleashed it. Because in a country long told it had nothing, the people were beginning to realize they had each other. That realization sparked something powerful. Pride without arrogance, resistance without hatred, ambition without apology. And that is what made Traoré's leadership so fundamentally different. He didn't act as if he had all the answers. He acted as if the people did. In doing so, he flipped the very model of governance. Instead of asking what international donors would fund, he asked what citizens wanted most urgently. And then he made government the tool, not the master. Roads were repaired not because of billion-dollar grants, but because local engineers were hired and held accountable. Clinics reopened not through flashy ribbon cuttings, but through quiet procurement reforms that ensured medicine arrived and salaries were paid. In the process, an unfamiliar feeling took root: normalcy. And in a region where suffering had become normalized, that shift felt almost revolutionary. Meanwhile, outside observers struggled to make sense of it all. How could such a young leader with limited experience navigate such complexity? How could a country with so little be achieving so much, with so few allies and so many enemies? The truth was simpler than they imagined. Traoré had stopped playing the game. He refused to spend years drafting frameworks for the sake of appearances. He refused to treat governance as theater. He treated it like obligation. And that posture, so rare in an age of spectacle, began to inspire not just citizens, but other leaders. Quietly across the continent, advisors and ministers from struggling nations began requesting meetings with Burkina Faso's officials, not to criticize, but to understand, to ask what had worked, what had failed, what could be adapted. A silent diplomacy was unfolding, one not hosted in foreign capitals, but in dusty conference halls of African cities. And as that conversation grew, so did a deeper shift. The realization that Africa's biggest resource was never minerals or markets. It was mindset. For generations, that mindset had been shaped by dependency, by the belief that help must come from outside and that internal failure was inevitable. But now Burkina Faso was rewriting that code, 1 kilometer of road at a time, 1 classroom at a time, 1 farmer, soldier, nurse, and teacher at a time. And in doing so, it reminded an entire continent that its fate was not a matter of fate, it was a matter of choice. What began as a crisis has now become a template. Burkina Faso, once buried under the weight of foreign control and domestic dysfunction, had done more than just resist. It had rebuilt. And that example began quietly, then rapidly, to reshape conversations across the continent, not in elite forums or glossy conferences, but in ministries, marketplaces, and military academies. The question wasn't whether Traoré's model was flawless. It wasn't. The question was whether it offered a foundation on which others could build. And increasingly, the answer was yes. The alliance of Sahel states, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, solidified not only their defense coordination, but their economic planning. Together, they launched the first phase of a joint industrial policy focused on agricultural transformation and energy independence. Cross-border transport routes were mapped. Regional universities began exchanging faculty and students. Central bank officials began holding closed-door meetings on alternative reserves and new digital finance frameworks. These were not just reactions, they were blueprints. The AES bloc was becoming not just a defiant partnership, but an institution in the making, and its core principle was unshakable. Africa must govern itself. That principle echoed far beyond the Sahel. In Chad, Guinea, and even parts of coastal West Africa, opposition figures and civil society leaders began framing their demands around sovereignty, not just reform. In Kenya and Ethiopia, economic experts began writing papers openly praising the AES for prioritizing internal capacity over donor conditionality. Something unprecedented was unfolding, a political virus spreading across the continent, not of chaos, but of courage. The old guards noticed. ECO responded with sharper rhetoric, warning that breakaway movements threaten regional integration. But integration into what? Into systems that had overseen stagnation? Into frameworks that treated African states as extensions of foreign policy rather than equal partners? The more ECOWAS pushed its narrative, the more it sounded out of touch. Its threats of intervention rang hollow. Its calls for restoration felt theatrical. Because on the ground, people were living the difference. They weren't reading policy briefs. They were riding buses that finally reached rural towns. They were getting vaccinated in local clinics. They were registering their businesses without bribes. Meanwhile, the West watched uneasily as its traditional channels of influence narrowed. Ambassadors found doors closing. Consultants found contracts evaporating. Foundations found their access denied. In their place, African-led institutions were rising, leaner, slower, but deeply rooted. Not yet perfect, but no longer beholden. Traoré understood that this momentum could not be allowed to stall. He moved quickly to institutionalize reform. National assemblies were restructured to include more local voices. Oversight boards were created to track corruption. Civil-military cooperation committees were formed to monitor rights and responsibilities. For the first time in generations, the word state no longer felt like something imposed. It felt like something owned. And in owning it, Burkina Faso had done something few imagined possible. It had made sovereignty visible. It had turned it from a slogan into streetlights, from a chant into supply chains, from a flag into functioning systems. And in doing so, it reminded the world that Africa's real strength was never in what it could borrow, but in what it could build. By now, even Traoré's harshest critics could no longer deny what had taken shape. What began as a defiant takeover had become a deliberate transformation. And that transformation was no longer just Burkina Faso's. It belonged to Africa. From Cairo to Cape Town, whispers turned into questions, and questions into declarations. What if we no longer waited? What if we no longer begged? What if we no longer asked how much help we could get, but how much power we could reclaim? These weren't just slogans. They were reflections of a continental fatigue, a deep, collective exhaustion with systems that had promised progress, but delivered paralysis. Traoré did not invent this frustration. He embodied it, and in doing so, he gave it form, voice, and velocity. His leadership wasn't polished. It was raw. It didn't seek applause. It sought results. He didn't wear the language of diplomacy like armor. He wore the scars of a people who had waited too long. And that made him dangerous, not because he was divisive, but because he was undeniable. He exposed the illusion that stability meant silence, that democracy without dignity was acceptable, that poverty with permission was better than prosperity with risk. And in exposing it, he changed the terms of engagement. Burkina Faso was no longer on the periphery of global politics. It was at the center of a new conversation, a conversation about what it means to govern, to build, and to belong. That conversation had consequences. It threatened the foundations of ECOWAS, of IMF conditionality, of post-colonial control repackaged as cooperation. And those threatened institutions reacted as they always had, with warnings, with sanctions, with isolation. But none of it worked, because the people had tasted something stronger than fear. Ownership. In dusty towns once ignored, children now attended schools that didn't charge hidden fees. In villages long forgotten, solar panels powered streetlights. In city clinics once empty, mothers held newborns wrapped in blankets sewn by local cooperatives. These weren't miracles. They were choices. And every choice chipped away at the belief that only outsiders could define Africa's destiny. Traoré never claimed to be the answer. He claimed something far more radical, that the answer was already within, that sovereignty was not a destination, but a daily discipline, that freedom was not granted, but guarded, that leadership was not a performance, but a promise kept in silence, in sacrifice, and in service. And so, as Burkina Faso moves forward, not without struggle, not without setbacks, but with direction, it carries something the world can no longer dismiss. Proof that Africa can govern itself. Proof that courage can be policy. Proof that dignity is a strategy. And that proof now lives in every paved road, every filled classroom, every village council that votes without foreign supervision. It lives in the eyes of elders who remember what was, and in the fists of youth who demand what will be. It lives not just in Burkina Faso, but in the hearts of those who watched from afar and whispered, "What if we could too?" Traoré did what the West feared not because he threatened them with weapons, but because he threatened them with a working example. He shattered the myth of dependency not through violence, but through governance. And in doing so, he left a mark on history no sanctions can erase. The new era has begun, not with declarations, but with deeds. And the world must now decide, will it fight to preserve what has failed, or finally listen to what is rising?